Professor Yehuda Bauer is Emeritus Professor of Holocaust Studies at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. And he's a historian and a renowned expert, a famous expert on everything concerning the Holocaust. He's also a scientific advisor to Yad Vashem, the Memorial Center for the Jewish Victims of the Holocaust. He has written a whole series of books, very many books, on the Holocaust, on its causes, on its development, and on its aftermath. He wrote about anti-Semitism, about the connection between the Holocaust and the establishment of the State of Israel, and on the historical interpretation of the Holocaust. Today he will speak on a subject which, at least for us Dutch, is pretty well unknown. For many years there has been an impression that Jews in Europe were murdered during the Holocaust by the Nazis without offering any serious resistance. As early as the 1970s, Professor Bauer has pointed out that this is not true, at least not true in a general sense. Tonight he will speak about Jewish resistance, about the ways in which it was organized, its character and its results. After his lecture I will put some questions to it, and then I will invite you, the audience, to join in with your questions and comments. En voeg er nog even het Nederlands aan toe. Degene die u vanavond hier in huis heeft als gast is echt een van de wereldwijd erkende experts op het gebied van de Holocaust. Dus welke vragen u ook heeft over de Holocaust, dit is het moment om hem te stellen. I wish you a very interesting evening and I would like to give the floor to Professor Yehuda Bauer.
Thank you very much. I would like to start by pointing out some background information. Nobody foresaw the Holocaust. And by Holocaust I mean, of course, the genocide of the Jewish people at the hands of Nazi Germany, its allies, supporters and collaborators during World War II. Nobody foresaw it, and there are of course people who say, yes, this personality or that personality predicted that something like that would happen. When you look at it carefully, nobody really did. When they talked in the late 1930s about the possibility of a catastrophe that might happen if a war broke out, what they meant was an economic and social disaster. The head of the Zionist organization, World Zionist Organization, Chaim Weizmann, spoke of 6 million victims. He meant refugees who would be looking for new homes. After World War I, there had been mass pogroms in the Ukraine. Some 70,000 Jews were killed between 1919 and 1921. It was in those terms that people thought that something might develop in Europe. We're talking about pogroms, not about mass murder of millions. Nobody foresaw it. Not only the Jews didn't foresee it, the Germans didn't foresee it either. People say that Hitler in Mein Kampf wrote about what to do with the Jews. That's untrue. If you look at Mein Kampf by Hitler, it doesn't say what should be done with the Jews. If you look at the speeches of Hitler until 1939, there was no indication of any detailed plan. What would happen to the Jews under German rule? In fact, as late as 1940, and to be precise, on May 25th, 1940, Heinrich Himmler, who 1 year later would become the chief executioner of the Jewish people in Europe, wrote a memorandum to Hitler. This is 15 days after the invasion of the Netherlands and Belgium and Luxembourg, on the way to defeat France. And Himmler writes a memorandum what to do with the occupied Poland, German-occupied Poland, the part of Poland that was occupied by the Germans. what to do with the Poles, with the Jews, with the Ukrainians, with the Lithuanians, and with others. And amongst other things, he says, everything is better than the annihilation of a people, which is Bolshevik, un-German, and unthinkable. And Hitler writes on the margins of the memorandum, veristic, very correct. This is 1 year before it starts. Because the mass murder of the Jews starts with the German invasion of the Soviet Union on June 22nd, 1941. So the Germans didn't know until very late in the day, until probably the early part of 1941, before the invasion of the Soviet Union, and then it developed. There was no pre-planning of the Holocaust. The planning developed together with the mass murder. The mass murder was the result of a consensus. And the consensus was built on an ideology that did not explicitly say to murder the Jews. But the logical conclusion was that if other means failed, the Jews should be killed. It didn't say that. It implied it. And the consensus grew as the Nazis developed plans what to do with the Jews. To expel them, to deport them. In 1940, the idea was to expel them to Africa. In early 1941, to expel them to the Arctic regions of Russia in the future invasion and conquest of the Soviet Union. When all these measures failed, the logical conclusion was, kill them. And at first, it was the Jews of the occupied Soviet Union. It developed over the summer of 1941 into a plan to expand this into parts of Poland. And by the fall of 1941, it became a program for not only Poland, but for the whole of Europe. And at the end of 1941, the intention was to expand this program to the whole world. So this was in stages, you see. There was no possibility to react to the Holocaust before it happened. The idea that somebody should have rescued the Jews before that is illogical. Rescue from what? From an anti-Semitic regime, but not from a mass murder that had not happened and had not yet been planned. So the reaction of the Jews was a reaction to a violently anti-Semitic regime. And the reaction was, and this is really extremely unusual, even during the 1930s in Germany, to build morale, to expand Jewish education, to engage in social welfare, and to try to emigrate Jews from Nazi Germany to safety somewhere else. Now, this kind of reaction you can find in other genocides too, if you look carefully. But it develops when the war breaks out into something that you don't find anywhere else, as far as I know. Before the Germans decided to kill all the Jews. And before there was this terrible expansion of the murder program. The idea was in the ghettos of Poland to establish some kind of an internal response, and the internal response in part, in places, not everywhere, was to establish the kind of thing that I would call standing up against German intentions, whether they understood German intentions or whether they didn't. In order to understand that, let me tell you something about who the Jews were before World War I and at the beginning of World War I. Before World War II, not one, two. Before World War II, the largest Jewish population in Europe was in Poland. 3.3 million Jews. 10% of the total population of the Polish Republic. But while there were other ethnic and national groups in Poland, Ukrainians and Belarusians and Lithuanians and Germans, they were concentrated in certain areas. The Jews were spread all over the place because that is how they had entered Poland in the 13th and 14th and 15th centuries, and that is how they developed their lives in the different communities where they settled. Before World War II, the economic and social situation of the Jews had become an impossibility. There was rising Polish anti-Semitism in a situation of an economic crisis, with a Catholic Church in Poland, not necessarily in other places in the same way or to the same extent, but in Poland a violently anti-Semitic ideology was developing. And this time it was accepted by large parts of the Polish population because of the economic crisis. And in this kind of a situation, roughly 1/3 of the Polish Jews were living on and below the poverty level. There were places in Poland where Jewish children couldn't go to school because they didn't have shoes in the winter when there was school. They had nowhere to go. They couldn't stay in Poland. There was anti-Semitism, there was an economic crisis. Where would they go? America was closed. Western Europe was closed. The British closed Palestine to the Jews. There was nowhere to go. At the end of 1938 and in early 1939, there were elections to the Jewish communities in Poland. In these elections, a plurality, 38% of the Jews voted for the anti-Zionist and anti-religious Socialist Bund Party. 35% voted for different types of Zionist parties, hoping to reach Palestine. 23% voted for Orthodox Jewish bodies. The ideas that people had, I know in the Netherlands as well, that Polish Jewry was Orthodox Jews in traditional dress, going to synagogues and so on and so forth. This is only partly true. About 1/4 of the Jewish population of Poland lived that way. Doesn't mean to say that the others were not religious. Even the Bund supporters, the Bund party, as I said, was anti-religious. Even they, but this was a kind of traditional continuation of Jewish life. And they voted for the Bund, not because they necessarily identified with socialist ideals and, you know, a idealism of a future Polish state where everybody would be equal, but because the Zionists had no answer. Palestine was closed. The Orthodox had no answer. God was not intervening in favor of the Jews. The West was closed. Where would they go? So maybe this idea of the Bund, that there might be some future for a socialist Poland where everybody would be equal, maybe that might be an answer. But basically, Polish Jewry didn't want to stay where it was and didn't have anywhere to go. I'm not arguing that this was a Holocaust before the Holocaust. I'm arguing that this was a very, very difficult situation. And paradoxically, while the objective situation, economic and social and political, of the Jews in Poland was very, very bad, there was a flowering of Jewish culture. In Yiddish, in Hebrew, in Polish. There were wonderful works written fiction, poetry. There were theater performances. There was music. This went along with near starvation, with hunger, with deprivation. Nobody, including myself, can really explain this kind of situation. And then the war comes. And the first thing that the Germans did in Poland was to establish ghettos. It starts, the Germans invaded in September 1939. The first ghetto was established in October. And then it spreads. There was never a plan before the Germans invaded Poland to establish ghettos. It was a consensus amongst the Nazis that arose as they went in. Not everywhere in Poland there were ghettos. And of course, as Nazi Germany expanded, other countries were involved. In Romania, there were 760,000 Jews. There were no ghettos in Romania. Romania was under the rule of a fascist dictatorship that was collaborating with Nazi Germany. It would later murder 400,000 Romanian Jews, not the Germans, the Romanians, with German support and direction. There were other countries, but the bulk of the Jewish population was in Poland, and after the invasion of the Soviet Union, the 2 million Jews that were in the USSR at the time. And these ghettos that the Nazis established were transitional concentration points, because I'm talking about 1939 and 1940, before the decision to mass murder the Jews was taken. And the ghettos were holding places to have the Jews transported later on somewhere else, to Africa. Now, how did the Jews react? One has to realize that the Jews were not part of any kind of a political governing system. The Polish army, for instance, before World War II, had very few Jewish officers. Not one of them was an officer in the foot soldiers, amongst the foot soldiers. They were experts, physicians, engineers. There were quite a number of Jewish officers, never in the regular army, never in the Air Force, never in the very limited tank regiments that the Polish army had. And when the Polish army collapsed and they hid their weapons in caches somewhere, the Jews had no access. The Jews had no military expertise in Poland. They didn't have military expertise in Romania either. And when the underground, the Polish underground, started immediately after the Polish defeat, Jews were excluded. The underground Polish army did not accept Jews. There were some individual Jewish people in the underground Polish army who pretended not to be Jewish. But there was a decision not to accept Jews in the underground Polish forces. So there was no possibility of armed resistance, not only because the Jews didn't know yet that there would be mass murder, but also because, objectively speaking, they had no access to arms, they had no access to anything. Was there a Jewish political representation? The Jews are a civilization that is traditionally divided. There was no united political representation of Polish Jewry prior to World War II. There was no political representation of German Jewry until Hitler came to power. Only after he came to power, the Jews tried to establish some kind of a body that would represent them towards this new regime, which they didn't know what it intended towards them. In fact, the first political representation of German Jews was established 8 months after Hitler came to power in Berlin at Jewish initiative, not German initiative. There was no united Jewish representation in Britain. There is a Board of Deputies of British Jews since the 18th century, but these are synagogues, and by World War II, half of British Jewry didn't go to synagogues anymore. There was no united representation in America. So there was no Jewish body to represent them. The first attempt at a kind of an international organization, political organization of Jews, was in response to the Nazi rise to power in 1936, when the World Jewish Congress was founded, which embraced about half of the communities of Jews in the world. Not more than that. The Nazis invented, for their own purposes, a Jewish world conspiracy. There was a world conspiracy, not of Jews, but of Nazis. And when you look at the kind of attitude towards the Jews, you have to understand that Nazi ideology was a crucial element in this whole development. I can't go into the details of Nazi ideology, that's not my topic tonight. But the reaction of the Jews, once Nazis came to power, was, as I said, to establish education and social welfare and immigration. When the war starts and the ghettos in Poland are set up, there is an attempt to do something similar in the ghettos, not something that was directed from any center. Each community developed their own reaction. Sometimes there was no reaction at all. There was just collapse and obedience to German orders, and no attempt to react at all. Not only in Poland. You probably know about the development in the Netherlands after the conquest of the Netherlands by the Germans in May 1940, when they afterwards set up a Joodse in Amsterdam, and what they did, and how they complied with German orders. Not only that, to use the expression of a great Holocaust historian, this was anticipatory compliance. In other words, they complied in anticipation of German orders. Before the Germans had given their orders, they already complied. But there were other cases, in Germany for instance, and in Poland. Now I want to tell you something about the major ghettos in Poland. Because there you have a type of resistance which grew from the ground up, from the grassroots, not directed by anyone. The largest ghetto was in Warsaw. At its peak, there were close to 450,000 Jews squeezed in a tiny area, starving, dying in huge numbers. They established over 1,000 house committees. What was a house committee? It was elected by the House. Now, in Poland, before World War II, they built houses, 4 houses around a courtyard in the middle. So a house was actually 4 buildings, with 1 entrance only. And this house, in other words, 4 houses, elected a committee. What was the job of the committee? The job of the committee was to take care of the small children, first of all. The parents were taken for forced labor, or had to somehow make a living. Somebody had to look after the children. So older children, or young people, looked after the small children. There was a problem of bedding, of blankets, of things like that the Germans decided had to be fumigated every now and then to get rid of the lice So they took the bedding of people and they put the bedding into some fumigation machine. And it came out wet and moist in the Polish winter. And while this was being done, the people who owned the bedding were taken naked into steaming baths to clean them and to clean their clothes separately. And then when they came out, they got the clothes wet in the Polish winter, freezing temperature. And so the House Committee was trying to prevent this from happening, trying to help people when they came out of these bathing institutions. The House Committees established cultural activities. Now, there were plenty of artists, Jewish artists in Warsaw. And you had concerts, you had lectures. People came after forced labor in the evening, late in the evening. They got hot water, there was no tea. They got hot water in order for them to somehow be able to consume this cultural presentation. And this happens, you know, in hundreds of houses. Not every house committee was successful by any means, but many of them were. And then an underground group is developed. And the underground group concentrated these efforts and based them around soup kitchens, which were supplied by the Jewish administration of the ghetto with no means at all, practically. And in these soup kitchens, they were arranged according to political parties, underground, of course. And so people from a certain political direction went to a certain soup kitchen in order to get a little bit of food. Education. The Nazis passed a regulation closing all Jewish schools for kids from the age of 6, 7 on. I already dealt with a small one. Now, this was forbidden. But Jewish families organized teaching in what they called, for some reason, nobody understands why, they called them complets. Each complet consisted of 6, 10, 15 children from the neighborhood. And there was a teacher. And they had to be very careful that spies, Jewish spies, from the Gestapo wouldn't come in and find out. And they taught, these teachers taught these children. And they got something in return, a piece of bread. There were 2 high schools, underground high schools in the Warsaw Ghetto, that prepared young Jewish boys and girls for end of school, of high school, for what they called in German Abitur, when they reached the age of 18. Because in 1940 and early 1941, they were still convinced that they would survive the war. And in the future, these young men and women would develop, would study, or would work somewhere, and they had to get proper education. So there were 2 high schools, underground high schools in the ghetto, with the greatest of experts, because all these Jews who were spread all over Warsaw before the war were concentrated in the ghetto, and amongst them there were quite a number of brilliant people. So they studied mathematics, and chemistry, and history, and physics, and all kinds of other things. There were orphans. Lots of parents were dying. Children were left alone. And so a pre-existing organization before the war that had established orphanages now developed in the ghetto and established homes for orphans. There were doctors. There were not only doctors who rescued, there were nurses who went into the places where typhoid epidemics were spreading. Many of them died of typhoid, of the nurses. And new nurses were studying in a special underground school in Warsaw to study nursing. The head of that effort actually survived the war. And she then gave the documentation and the information that we needed in order to write this up. And the doctors, the physicians, wrote a book. And the book deals with hunger. What are the effects of hunger on the human body? They checked themselves. And they checked the people they were treating. And that book is still in use today in Poland. It's the only real experimental, if you like, effort to find out the effects of hunger on the human body in a mass experiment engineered by the Nazis. Is all this resistance? And I would say yes. Because the definition of resistance in this particular situation of the genocide of the Jews is acting against the real or perceived intention of the Nazi rulers. Whether this was actually what they wanted, or whether the Jews thought that that was what they wanted, to act against that. That was resistance. And then comes the period when everybody realizes that the Nazis are going beyond that. There are rumors coming into Poland that there is mass killing in the occupied areas of the Soviet Union. And in those areas themselves, in the conquered areas of the Soviet Union, the Western Soviet Union, Jews quickly realize that what the Nazis are doing is mass murder without any differentiation. And interestingly enough, in many cases, the reaction is the same as in Warsaw. Without anyone giving any direction, without anyone sending letters or suggesting any idea, this is local in all these communities. Now I say all these communities who did that, because there were communities that were totally helpless and hopeless, where nothing happened, where the community structure was destroyed, where there was no mutual help, where there was no education, not a sign of any culture, not a sign of any religious observance, where the community was ruled by people who were collaborating with the perpetrators, with the murderers. And in the next door community, the reaction of the Jews is exactly the opposite. Let me give you an example, rather than sort of speak in general terms. There was a ghetto in a town that before the war was Poland, and then was occupied by the Soviets, and then of course by the Germans. It's in today the Western Ukraine. The name of the town is Kremenets, in Polish Krzemieniec, and in Yiddish Kremnitz. It's the same place. There were 14,000 Jews there in the ghetto, because from the original Jewish population of Kremnitz, people were added from the surrounding smaller communities and villages. So there were 14,000. The Judenrat, the Jewish council that was appointed by the Germans, was led one after the other by two people from Western Poland who were just about the worst kind of person you could possibly imagine. They were exactly what I just said. They were collaborators with the Germans. They prevented the smuggling of food into the ghetto. They thought they would survive by doing everything that the Nazis wanted them to do. Of course, they were killed in the end, like everyone else. Kremnitz is an example, is a counter-example to Jewish resistance. And not that far away from Kremnitz, there is a town today in Western Belarus by the name of Baranovice, or that's the Polish name, in Byelorussian it's Baranovichi. And in that place there was a similar number of Jews in the ghetto, 12,000. At the beginning of the German occupation, the Jews in that town, political leaders from before the war, established a Judenrat, a Jewish council, and put at its head a young man, about 32, 33 years of age, by the name of Ovsier Isaacson. Ovsier is Isaiah, Hebrew Yeshayahu. Ovsier Isaacson, who was politically, because Jews are political animals, a general Zionist, in other words, a liberal conservative Zionist person. He didn't want to accept the job. He was forced by the Jews to accept it. Then he set up a Judenrat, which was approved by the Germans. The Germans had no idea who these people were. And it was composed of representatives of pre-war Jewish bodies. Left-wing, right-wing, religious, secular. And Isaacson and his major help, a woman secretary, who with her husband had escaped into Baranovichi from another place, they established an internal administration in the narrow confines of the ghetto, where they established a Jewish police whose job was to settle quarrels between neighbors in very crowded conditions, you know, one kitchen for the whole house with lots of families and so on. The police were tasked to secure hygiene, to see everything was clean, to help the doctors, the physicians in the ghetto. Isaacson encouraged the establishment of an underground resistance organization. Isaacson saw to it that the small children and other, different from Warsaw, small children and children of school age were being educated by the grandparents because the grandparents couldn't go out for forced labor. The parents had to go out for forced labor. So somebody had to take care of the kids. And the grandparents taught the kids, organized by the Judenrat. The Judenrat organized smuggling of food into the ghetto. I'm talking now about the conquest of this place by the Germans and the first months after that. So I'm talking from July 1941 to March 1942. And in March 1942, the Germans murdered Isaacson and his woman secretary. And the second man, who was appointed instead of Isaacson, was a young man who had run a bicycle shop before the war. No great intellectual, just an ordinary decent person. His name was Shmuel Yankelevich. And Yankelevich continued the policy of Isaacson, exactly the same thing. And when the Nazis then murdered most of the ghetto in September 1942, they murdered Yankelevich's wife and little daughter, and he escaped to the forest, and he became a partisan. And instead of him, a man was appointed, a refugee from Poland by the name of Goldberg, and he died trying to organize an escape from the ghetto by the Jews who were still living there. So 3 heads of Judenrat, one after the other, doing this kind of unarmed resistance. Now there was an armed resistance in Baranovichi, but that's a separate story. I'm coming to that in a second. So you see, there is this kind of reaction. Unarmed resistance. I'm taking Poland as an example, but I could go elsewhere too. I could go to Slovakia. I could go to Lithuania. I could go to other places in Europe where there was this kind of reaction, in France, for instance. And interestingly enough, they had no information in France about what was happening in Poland. There was no connection at all. And they reacted in much the same way. Some of them collapsed, others didn't, and stood up against what they perceived in those situations in those countries as the German policies. Now, that's unarmed resistance. What about armed resistance? I said already, the Jews had no access to arms. Now, Jews joined underground organizations all over Europe. Understandably, because they were the first ones to be persecuted. They were the first ones to be endangered. So whoever could, young people of course, joined the underground resistance movement. This is not Jewish resistance. This is resistance of Jews. Usually, not always, in the framework of the general resistance movement in that particular country. We take an example, France. There were Jewish units, yes, very few. There was a Jewish Maquis. There was a Jewish armed resistance group in 1943 and 1944 that actually liberated one French town. But most Jews who were part of the French resistance didn't join Jewish units. There were only few. They joined the general French resistance. The first French resistor who was executed by the Germans in 1942 was a Polish Jew in France. And the commander of the immigrants who organized resistance in France against the Germans was a Jew by the name of Epstein. So there was not Jewish resistance, resistance of Jews. This last example were Jewish communists. Jews joined other groups, Gaullists, and other groups as well. Did they join because they were Jews, or did they join because they were French patriots? Well, most of them joined for both reasons. They wanted to get rid of the Germans in France, but they joined because they were persecuted as Jews. So it's sort of an in-between situation. How many were there? Well, until today we are not quite certain, but there were several thousand. There were 2,000 Jews that joined the Italian partisans in Italy. There were 1,600 Jews who joined the Slovak partisans in the Slovak mountains. There were Jews in armed resistance groups in Bessarabia, in what before the war was Romania. And there were Jews in Poland who joined armed resistance groups. In Poland, there were Jewish armed groups. And in Poland, as I said, the general underground didn't accept Jews. The communist underground did. But not as Jewish units, but as individuals. So Jews did establish a number of Jewish units as well. How many were there? Very hard to say. Approximately 5,000 in western and central Poland. Now, in western and central Poland, there were ghetto rebellions. You all know about them. There was a famous ghetto uprising in Warsaw. This was at the most, 700 young men and women. There were two organizations, underground armed organizations in the ghetto of Warsaw. The main one was a Jewish fighting organization, which had all of 16 rifles, no machine gun. They had hand grenades, self-made hand grenades. They had pistols, about 500 pistols. And then there was a second organization, smaller one, that had one machine gun. It was the Jewish underground army. It was 200-300 people. And the two, in the end, they quarreled with each other. In the end, they combined. So you have a maximum of 700 years. But this is wrong, because it was actually 40,000. because all the inhabitants of the Warsaw Ghetto at that point, in early 1943, joined the resistance. They didn't have any weapons, so they couldn't fight. But they hid. They were not going to deliver themselves to the Germans. They hid in bunkers. They tried to survive in underground situations. Most of them were found, practically actually all of them were found, and they were killed. Of the fighters, a small number of the main organization, at the head of which stood a young man by the name of Mordechai Nilevich. A small number survived. Of the other organization, one boy of 14 years of age survived. They fought to the end. And if you look at any future time, at a wonderful film, perhaps the most important film that was made on the Holocaust, by Claude Lanzmann, called Shoah, which is the Hebrew word for Holocaust. In there you have, at the end of the film, it's a very long film, 9.5 hours. At the end of the film you find Warsaw Ghetto Rebellion. And you find the testimony of the man, he's still alive, who led out through the sewage system in Warsaw, the last remnants of the fighting organization into the non-Jewish part of Warsaw. But you see, this was not the only place. There was armed resistance in other ghettos, in Krakow, in Vilna, in Kovno, Kaunas, in Lithuania, and in some other places as well. In fact, in 16 places in Poland, there were rebellions, half-rebellions, attempts at rebellion, armed rebellion. Now, I said the Jews had no access to arms. So what did they rebel with? Well, in some cases with no arms. In most cases by capturing arms from German soldiers, by buying arms from Italian soldiers passing through Poland. And with that non-armed basis, they conducted armed resistance. But the ghettos weren't the only place. In eastern Poland, there are huge forests, jungles, jungle forests. It was there that the Soviet partisan movement arose. Paradoxically, to this day, we have only one historical analysis of the Soviet partisan movement. You won't believe this. There are hundreds upon hundreds of personal stories, of testimonies, of memories written. We have that. But historical analysis and overall picture, no. You would imagine that under the Soviet regime, the great Soviet partisan war, you would have a historical analysis. Let's say from a Soviet point of view, none, doesn't exist. The only book was published about 3 years ago. It's a book by a Polish-German author, worth reading, those of you who read German. His name is Bogdan Musiał, M-U-S-I-A-L. And he wrote a book about the Soviet partisan. It's a first attempt. It has to be complemented. It has to be researched in much greater detail and a much wider perspective. So we don't really know about the Soviet partisan movement beyond propaganda of the Soviet Union. Now, how many Jews joined that? The Jews who joined the partisan movement joined only after the destruction of their communities, to flee into the forest. You didn't know whether you would survive in the forest. If you had children, what are the children going to live on? How are you going to survive? And then the Nazis murdered the Jews in those areas in 1941 and 1942. It was only at the end of 1942 that a significant Soviet partisan movement arose in those areas. So by the time the Soviet partisan movement came into existence, the Jews were no longer there. So we are dealing with remnants. And the truth of the matter is that in the early stages of the Soviet partisan movement, thousands, and I'm not exaggerating, thousands of Jews were murdered by Soviet partisans. And then the policy changed, and thousands of Jews were rescued by Soviet partisans. You see, it's not an easy story. It's not black and white. It's different shades of gray. Now, how many Jews managed to join the partisan movement? The figure that we have now, and this is probably not the final figure, is 23,000. Now, I'm not supposed to know what the number of soldiers in a division in the Israeli army. But 23,000 are about 3 divisions over that. So there was a very significant number of Jews in the Soviet partisan movement. In fact, the estimate is about 6%. The total number of Soviet partisans is supposed to have been about 400,000. So we are dealing with a significant number, but of course a minority. What did these Jews do? How did they react in the forest? Why did they join the party? Why did they fight? The basic motivation of the Jewish partisans in Eastern Europe and elsewhere, in France, in Italy, in Yugoslavia, where there were 7,000 of them, in Slovakia and other places, in Greece, was revenge. Not nice, perhaps, to a humanistic, democratic Western audience, but the basic motivation was the revenge. They killed my parents, my wife, my husband, my children, my relatives. I will give no quarter. I can tell you the truth, that when a German was captured by a Jewish unit or by Jewish partisans, he did not survive for more than a few minutes. There were some exceptions, because sometimes the Soviet commanders wanted a certain German to be transported to Moscow by plane in order to investigate what he knew. But the revenge was there. Secondly, of course, the will to survive, and possibly to rescue relatives. Maybe relatives who were hiding in the forest without being able to join the partisans, because we're talking about women and children and old people. Sometimes, hopefully, there will be somebody left from my family. That was the second motivation. And then, yes, to liberate the area, the Soviet Union, Poland, the Jewish people, from the Nazis. Now, I'm talking about Nazis. I should be talking about Germans, because the vast majority of the German people identified with the Nazi regime. Now, our closest collaborators today as historians are German and Polish historians. It is with them that we work together. There is no German historian today who will relate to this story and say Nazis. He will say Germans. Because the exceptions in Germany were about 5, 6, 7, 8% of the population. And the others were, it was possible to recruit them to do everything that the Nazi regime wanted. So you had a combination of motives, of motivations. And yes, there was a desire to rebuild and reconstitute after the war what would be left of the Jews in Europe and elsewhere, because they knew by that time that the Nazis had the intention of extending the mass murder of the Jews to everywhere in the world. So you had to defeat the Nazis, the Germans, in order to re-establish something of a Jewish presence. Was there a Jewish self-consciousness? Well, that's very difficult to say. In Eastern Europe, certainly. In France, in most cases. In other places, too. But there were many Jews who didn't want to be Jews anymore because that had only led to disaster. And there was the other reaction, the opposite reaction as well. So you see, and these people resisted. So you have resistance of Jews in different situations, different countries, different possibilities. But the conclusion is very clear. The conclusion is that the Jewish people, in part, in important part, resisted unarmed, and wherever it was possible, armed resistance, but there were many cases where there was no resistance at all, where there was a total collapse of the community. Did I answer the question? If you ask me now whether I answered the question, I'd say no. It's work in progress. Thank you.
Thank you very much for an impressive story. Let me perhaps begin with the beginning of the fate of the Polish Jews. Was their fate sealed by the fact that they were so isolated within Poland itself? Was that the most important factor?
I think it was a factor, yes. I don't think it was a decisive factor, but certainly yes. The Jews were isolated in the sense that the population, now one has to be very careful. 12% of the Polish people voted for the Polish Socialist Party, which was against anti-Semitism. Or to be precise, 12.5%. Yeah? And there was a more liberal, let us say, Polish peasant party, which was led by a person who later on became a Polish leader, Mikołajczyk. They were not violently anti-Semitic. They didn't particularly love Jews, but they were not going to persecute them. But the majority of the Polish population was, I called it hostile indifference. And there was a very strong anti-Semitic movement, as I said, in the Catholic Church, which again has to be seen in detail and not generalized too much. The primate of Poland, Cardinal Augustus Hlond, was an unreformed, violent anti-Semite. And he made declarations which look today, you know, like, I don't know, some crazy violent anti-Semitic propaganda. At the same time, you had village priests, Catholic priests, who rescued Jews. You had monasteries and nunneries, some of whom rescued Jewish children in order to convert them. And other monasteries and nunneries rescued Jewish children in order not to convert them, but to maintain their lives as Jews. So you have, see, a different kind of, but generally speaking, yes, the Catholic Church in Poland was anti-Semitic, no doubt. With all these exceptions. Yeah? Now, so you had the Jews isolated, yes. Was there total isolation? No. And it depends on the area that you consider. For instance, in northeastern Poland, around a town called Lomża, you can find it in the map, it's today in northeastern Poland, that was a center of violent anti-Semitism. If you go to southeastern Poland, in the area of Lublin, in the forest, in the area of forest, the big forest there called Parczew, the Parczew forest, you find a completely different attitude of the villagers. So it depended on historical circumstances in certain areas. But yes, again, the Jews were isolated, and that certainly was a major hindrance in rescue. We now have Polish colleagues. As I said before, our closest collaborators are Germans and Poles. There's a group of Polish colleagues. I don't know whether any one of you reads Polish, but it's worth learning Polish just in order to read their stuff. And they are now investigating area by area the attitudes of the peasants. And there's plenty of documentation. And they find in area after area that the majority of Polish peasants were willing to take away the property of the Jews and then hand them over to the Germans.
But nevertheless, I've read, in preparation of this interview, I read some of your books. And one impression I got was that individual character was a decisive factor in many cases.
Definitely, yes. You have, when I try to analyze the basic reaction, first of all of Jews, but also of the non-Jewish environment, it depended not only on historical circumstances and influence of outside, but basically on individual character. Let me tell you a story. Yeah? A Jew in a town called Zborów, never mind the name of the town, who is a political activist and a very energetic person, has a family, he and 8 others, aunt and cousin and so on, and 2 children and wife and so on. And he understands at a certain point that he's got to hide. So he goes to a Polish peasant. And the name of the peasant was Mikulowski. Now, Mr. Mikulowski is a peasant with a family in a farm. Yeah? And this Jewish acquaintance comes to him and says, rescue us, hide us. He said, look, I have a family. If they discover you, they won't just kill you and your family, they kill me and my family as well. And they burn down my farm. Nothing will be left. I can't do this. So the Jew tells him, you know what, go to your priest. And he goes to the priest. And the priest says, have you read the New Testament? Have you read Jesus and the Samaritan? Act like that. You've got to save human life. And the peasant says, I'll save these people. So he goes to a cabbage field that he owns, and he digs a hole in the ground, yeah, for 9 people. This is Poland, you know. The winters are considerably colder than what you have outside here now, yeah. And they stay there for 1.5 years. And the man and his wife devote their lives in order to feed them. This is very difficult, because if they buy more products than the family would need, then they're hiding someone, they're supplying someone, so they have to go in distant places in order to get some food and so on and so forth. And they do that for 1.5 years. And in that hole, this man educates his 2 daughters, teaches them maths and foreign languages and whatnot. Yeah? And then they hear the artillery of the Soviet army, the Red Army that is advancing towards them. And as they sit in the hole, they hear 2 men above them, above the hiding place, talking in Russian. Kakaya хорошая kapusta. What wonderful cabbage. And they say to the father, let's get out, the Russians are. He said, no, wait a minute. These could be Russian collaborators with the Germans. And so they wait. And in the meantime, they find out from the peasant and his wife that indeed these 2 Russians were German soldiers. And then the man and his wife come and say, listen, We've got orders from the Germans to abandon our farm and to go west with them, with the Germans. We can't help you anymore. We are going to supply you tonight with as much food as we can, so you can hold out as long as possible. And they give them the food, and they disappear because the Germans went away. And after about 3 or 4 days, the fighting still goes on above the hiding place. The cover is lifted, and the peasant and his wife are there. We escaped from the German convoy. And the first thing we thought about is you. And so we come to check whether you are still okay. And next day the Russians came. Have I answered your question?
You have, yeah. You told us some examples of Jewish resistance with bare hands, really, against a German army, which was the mightiest army in the world.
Yes, yeah.
What did people expect to achieve?
To fight. They didn't expect to survive. This is not only true of the Warsaw Ghetto Rebellion and other similar rebellions. But there was a hope, a little tiny hope. Even when you were absolutely convinced that you were going to die. Maybe. Perhaps you, maybe some of the others would nevertheless survive. There's a contradiction there, yeah? So you find this contradiction not only in memoirs, you find it in the documentation from the time itself. And of course, the Jewish partisans in the forest did expect to survive, or at least some of them. And that's why that was the reason they wanted to survive, so they fought, yeah? You know, you go today in the streets of Israeli cities or Jews abroad, and on sort of memorial days, you find all these Jewish partisans with their medals, you know, across the chest. This is what they had. It's not only they, of course, the Russian and Ukrainian and other comrades are the same. But they fought in order to fight the Germans, to fight the Nazis, to avenge their families and so on.
What has Jewish resistance in the war, what has it meant for Jews after the war?
It was the Jews after the war had a completely distorted picture. The picture was that the vast majority went like sheep to the slaughter, and there were a few exceptions, which is absolutely untrue. First of all, they were not sheep to the slaughter because human beings are not sheep. Secondly, this wasn't slaughter, it was murder. And thirdly, when you are in a family situation, and this happened all over the place, and you are led somewhere, you have no possibility to resist. You have to go. Are you going to abandon your family, your wife, your children, your husband, your parents, your siblings, and so on? No way. You're going to go with them. I have a story of a man who survived Treblinka. Now, he was led in Warsaw to the place is called the Umschlagplatz, the place from which the trains went to Treblinka, to the gas chamber. Now, he went with his family, obviously. A young man, he has to protect his parents and siblings and so on, yeah? And he, because he was the protector, he went first in the row. And the Germans counted people to put in the different wagons. When they reached a certain number, in this case 80, they pushed them into the wagon. And he was the first, yeah? So he was the last in one wagon, and his family in the other. He knew that he would never see his family again, because they were in the other wagon. So he jumped from the window of the wagon. Now, he says in his testimony, if I had been with them in the same wagon, I wouldn't have been here. I would have gone with them. I wouldn't have abandoned them.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm sure you have questions on the Holocaust. Yes, please. Do we have a microphone?
Yeah.
Just a second, please.
Thank you. I want to apologize for my question. It's a bit, yeah, I want to apologize for my question. It's a bit morbid.
Could you raise your voice?
Yes, of course. Sorry. I would like to apologize for my question. I'm a little bit ashamed for the question, but what triggers me is why did the Nazis or the Germans plan their mass destruction all the camps in Poland? Because it's a big industry to destroy people. It's a very logistical operation which escalated during a few years. Why did they plan it all in Poland? Why didn't they plan it in Germany and in France and in the Netherlands? Then it would be more efficient. That's the question. Why did it happen in the way it developed?
The answer is really, as you said, logistical. The majority of the Jews were in Eastern Europe. And they were in between Poland and the western part of the Soviet Union. So Treblinka, Sobibor, Majdanek, Belzec are in the eastern part of Poland. It was much easier to bring them there, to bring them anywhere else. There were 140,000 Jews in the Netherlands. There was no point in doing it here. In any case, the Nazi attitude to the German attitude to the Netherlands or to Belgium was different from the Nazi attitude to Poland, because they hoped the Netherlands to become part of the German Reich, and the Dutch would become a type of Germans. Yeah? So this was not the place to do this. They had to be transported elsewhere. The same applies to Germany. There's actually a meeting in Goering's office in 1938 where this is said pretty almost explicitly. Yeah? We can't do it here, we have to do it elsewhere. No. So this is a reason. But you see, the implication of your question is gas chambers. But half of the Jews that were murdered were not murdered in gas chambers. They were murdered in villages and towns outside of villages. They were shot into ditches. Millions. So it's not just... Jews were not killed in concentration camps in large numbers. In death camps and in ditches. Again, something you see which is extremely difficult to explain because there is such a public knowledge, so to speak. The Jews were killed in gas chambers. This is only partly true.
Thank you. Any other questions? Yes.
Thank you very much. I was wondering, you mentioned all sorts of reasons why the resistance from the Jewish community was difficult. I was wondering, to what degree do we know anything about fear of repercussion? For a lot of individual people, you know, they must have had an idea of, and if they were discovered, it would probably have repercussions for their wife, their family, their friends, or whatever. It must be very difficult to get, you know, some effects on this maybe, but I imagine that must be somehow a factor in, well, you know, getting less resistance, results from resistance maybe.
Yes, I think definitely yes. There was a fear of German retaliation. In fact, Jews escaped to the forests because they, in many cases, didn't want to resist in the ghetto. Because if they resisted in the ghetto, the Germans would come and kill all the ghetto. So that was definitely a consideration, yes. On the other hand, there was, in quite a number of cases, they said all of us are going to be killed anyway, so it doesn't make no difference. So there were rebellions in the ghetto, although they knew that everybody would be killed. And I'm not talking only of the big ghettos, you know, the stories that everybody has read in different places, but of the small ghettos. There were a large number of rebellions in small ghettos, especially in Eastern Poland and in the Western Soviet Union. Yeah? And they knew we rebel, they're going to kill us. But there's no choice anyway. I can give you an example. There's a place in formerly Eastern Poland called Rzeszów. In that place there was a rebellion by the Jews. Now the Germans came in and killed whoever they could, and the rest escaped to the forest. So this is a case, again, a clear case, yes, where there was a decision to rebel, never mind what the consequences will be. Again, you have to examine in detail. See, one of the things that I find in my research is, but not only I mean, this is now accepted by many of my colleagues, these generalizations that we were used to do are in many cases misplaced. It is impossible really to generalize beyond a certain point. Now, up to a point, yes. And in the overall picture, you can say, in the majority of cases, yes, in the minority of cases, no, you know. But all these generalizations of Jewish behavior and Jewish leadership, these are generalizations that don't work.
Kun je het doorgeven?
My question was, how did the animosity between the two resistance groups in Warsaw influence their resistance against the Germans? Because I read there was some competition between those two, and say something about that?
It looked at first as though this would be a disaster, because the two groups couldn't get an agreement. The smaller group was made up of right-wing Zionists who supported some kind of a military solution and so on and so forth. And they were joined, paradoxically, by communists. Yeah? They had a commander who had been a sergeant in the Polish army, so he had military experience, you know, as a sergeant. His name was Paweł Frankel. And they wanted to take over the leadership of the whole underground movement. And the others said no, the majority said no, we don't want that. We want Anielewicz to be the commander. So 2 or 3 nights before the rebellion broke out, or rather before the Germans marched in and the rebellion broke out, they agreed. You are going to take over this area, and we are going to take over that area. We'll inform each other, and we'll fight in collaboration. Now, the second group, the smaller group, the right-wing group, fought for 4 days, very courageously. They put up 2 flags on the building they occupied, a Polish flag and a Jewish flag. Yeah? And when they could no longer resist, they escaped through a tunnel which they had dug before, to the under the wall of the ghetto, into the Polish part. And they went to a house which was given to them by a contact with the Polish underground. And when they got into the house, this Polish underground person reported them to the Germans, and they were all killed. Which is why we have very little information. But groups of the second group, of that smaller group, yeah? Small groups of people like that were spread all over the ghetto, and we know now from a detailed investigation that they participated in the fighting no longer as a separate group. Because at that point, there was no point in any difference, yeah? So in fact, there was a combined resistance, but of course it was no longer organized from a center. You couldn't control it. So after the first week of the rebellion, say the rebellion started on the 19th of April 1943, by the end of April, these were separate groups in different places in the ghetto that were trying at night. During the day, the Germans controlled the streets to fight against the Germans with, you know, pistols and things like that. They no longer had any. The one machine gun that they had was long ago, and in the first days was already gone. Yeah? And they got practically, well, very, very little assistance from the Polish side. 2 or 3 cases of small Polish groups that tried to do something against the Germans outside of the ghetto. Nothing really. And then those who managed to escape were the people from the main organization, because they went through the sewage system, through this man that I mentioned. He's still alive, I said so, yeah? His official name is Simcha Rotem, and his nickname in the underground, by which he's known to this day in Israel, is Kazik. So Kazik wrote a very important memoir, very accurate. He has a wonderful mind. And wherever we could check what he was saying, we found it was absolutely correct.
Is it true that the rebellion in the Warsaw Ghetto had something to do with the Russians advancing?
No. No, not at all. It had something to do with the Germans deciding to liquidate the ghetto. And that was due to the fact that they knew that there was some kind of a Jewish organization and they were going to annihilate the ghetto. By that time there were over 40,000, probably more actually, maybe some 50, nobody knows exactly, some 50,000 Jews in the ghetto. And they decided to liquidate the ghetto. As a matter of fact, they transferred those who they captured and didn't kill immediately to 2 camps near Lublin, where they were put to forced labor for a few months, and then in November '43 they were killed, they were shot.
Did Jewish resistance for the Jews who were left, did it harden when the Russians were approaching?
Yes, definitely yes. They Jewish resistance. Well, by that time, you know, there were not many Jews left. Those who were left and could somehow join in opposing the Germans certainly did so. The interesting thing is this was very largely, in certain areas, women, because the men had been killed. And the Jewish women, it was easier for them to hide because Jewish men were circumcised. And Jewish women had a greater chance of acting. So you have quite a number of places where it was actually Jewish women who did the resistance. I find today and yesterday in the newspaper, you know, the American army decided that women can fight. You know, good morning. We know this from our history very well.
Questions? I'm going to that side.
Me?
Yeah.
Okay.
If you wait for the microphone, please. Where's the mic? Okay.
In fact, I've got 2 questions, but they're a bit interrelated. If you look in Germany, there were not that many Jews. What makes, and you know some stories about what could be reasons, but in that, what makes people in these times, what did make people so hostile against the Jews?
That's a big question.
Yeah, well, I would have to go into the history of anti-Semitism, and I can't do that here. You have in Europe generally a basic negative attitude to Jews, which comes from Christian anti-Semitism. Now this is sometimes watered down. One of the classic examples of almost no anti-Semitism at all is the Netherlands. The Jews came to the Netherlands from Portugal originally, yeah, at the end of the 15th, early 16th century, because the Dutch at that time were fighting against the Spaniards, and the Jews were persecuted by the Spaniards. And the Jews who came here from Portugal were traders, merchants. This was very useful. And you had Catholics and you had Calvinists in the Netherlands. So a small group of others didn't matter that much. There was no anti-Semitic policies in the Netherlands at all. You had individual anti-Semites, of course. The Dutch Nazi Party, until 1937, had Jewish members. Yeah? So you had even Dutch Nazis were not really anti-Semitic. They didn't particularly like Jews, but there was no anti-Semitism that we know it. On the other hand, if you look, for instance, with your neighbors in the Flemish part of Belgium, yeah, there was anti-Semitism there. There are historical reasons for that. Now, Christian anti-Semitism stems from the original conflict between the new religion, Christianity, and the old one, against which Christianity rebelled. And there was a real competition, because in the contrary to what you perhaps think, in the first centuries of the Christian era, Judaism was a proselytizing religion. And there was a real danger for Christians that the pagans would become Jews and not Christians. If you became a Jew by religion, you became a Jew by ethnicity. You accepted the whole baggage of the ethnic background of Jews when you joined. And there were large numbers of Roman citizens who became Jews. And this clash created an opposition. And the main church father, the great figure in Christian theology, Saint Augustine of Hippo, wrote a book in the year 429, which is called Contra Judaeos, against the Jews. And there he has, you can do anything you want to the Jews. They didn't want to recognize Jesus as a Messiah. They are sinners. You can take away their property, you can expel them, you can do anything you like, but you mustn't kill them, because they are humans, they have souls. They are created the men are created in the image of God. Women, whether Jewish or not Jewish, are not created in the image of God.
We all know that.
Yeah. Mulier non facta ad imaginem Dei. That's a quote from Augustinus. Yeah? Now, in this kind of a situation, you have many cases and a continuation of a tradition of anti-Jewishness. Even when you abandon Christianity for secularism, you have the tradition with you. And in Germany, Germany was not violently anti-Semitic before Hitler. The Jews were not particularly loved, and there was anti-Semitism in Germany. But one cannot say that there was radical anti-Semitism in Germany amongst the majority of the population. This was introduced before, during, and after World War I for ideological, political, economic reasons. And this is the answer to your question. You have, in the 1930s, a penetration of this Nazi ideology into the general population in Germany. By the end of the 1930s, the vast majority of Germans would follow their leadership in the policy against the Jews.
I also got one.
Waar is de microfoon? Oh, oké.
I also got one more.
Kun je die achter je doorgeven?
One question. In Holland, there is now still a discussion about what we knew in Holland from the persecution of the Jews, that there was gas chambers, etc. How many people knew this?
How many what?
How many people knew in Holland about
the destruction of the
murder
Jews?
of the Jews?
Because I can imagine that this knowledge was very important for Jews to resist. Maybe you told something at the beginning of your lecture about Poland. Would you say something more about it?
Well, you know, in June and July 1942, Radio Orange from London reported on the mass destruction of the Jews in Poland. How many people heard it? How many people believed it? That's a very difficult question. Amongst the Jews, there was no real knowledge of what was happening in Eastern Europe. They thought this was a terrible thing, deportation was awful, and probably people wouldn't survive, but they didn't know any details. There was no real knowledge about anything. The Nazis managed, the Germans managed to keep this secret. Was there a penetration of the knowledge into Holland? Yes, there was. We know exactly. There were 2 Dutch non-Jewish women who were liberated by the Germans from Auschwitz, who came to Holland and reported to the Dutch underground what they saw.
Did they believe it?
No, nobody believed them.
No. I may add perhaps that last week we had Jules Schelvis as our guest,
Yeah.
and he's a survivor from Sobibor, and he took the opportunity to tell us that when he was in the train to Sobibor, he did not know
Of course not.
that Jews would be murdered in Sobibor.
Yeah. Nobody knew. Now, people in the East knew because they saw it.
Yeah.
But in the West, the information was there because, as I said, it was transmitted by radio from London. But people didn't believe it.
It's still hard to believe.
Yeah, it's hard to believe, but of course today we know it's true. Yeah? But even then, there were people who got the information and believed it. Not in Holland, not in France, not in Germany.
Not in England.
Well, in England you had In England you had a declaration at the end of, on the 17th of December 1942, the nations that were fighting Germany announced publicly that the Jews in Europe were being murdered. This was spread all over the place. In Europe they didn't believe it.
There was a question here in front.
Okay. As I told you, I was born in kibbutz in Israel, and I want to ask you something about another aspect. As children, in the Yom HaShoah, in the day of Shoah, we was taking all of us to Yad Mordechai, and we celebrated there the brave things which Mordechai and Levitch did, and we went back to our kibbutz. Nobody of us was mourning about what happened to our families. You understand what I mean? This is my question. Why? What happened there?
I think
you didn't told us really what happened to our families.
Well,
I mean, you understand what my question?
No, not really.
I try again. The grown-ups of the kibbutz was organized for us a celebration each year, and they didn't organize for us to mourn about our relative which was murdered. You understand the question?
Yeah, I understand now.
Okay, that's the question.
I think that this has changed very radically in the last 10, 20 years. We now concentrate on the individual and the family. It was extremely difficult 30, 40, 50 years ago to do that. The trauma was too heavy. The adults, the people who had lost their families in Europe, couldn't really face it. It was extremely hard. And those of us, I mean, of course a large proportion of the Jewish population in Israel lost families in Europe. Not all of them, by no means, yeah? To mourn your own family was done very privately, if at all. Usually it was hidden, especially from you children. They didn't want to talk about it. They didn't want to burden you with it. Now this has changed. The new museum in Yad Vashem, for instance, concentrates on the fate of the individuals and the families. Now you can talk about it. And the second and third and fourth generation after the Holocaust, but it's not only the people who are directly connected with it through their families, it's really all the others. Now, a Jewish person who comes from, I don't know, Argentina or lives in Argentina, yeah, and whose great-grandparents immigrated from Poland in the 19th century or something, there's absolutely no connection with the Holocaust at all. But the communal connection is there, very clearly there. This is not special to Jews, by the way. I find the same thing when I research the Holocaust, the genocide, for instance, of Armenians, or today of Tutsi in Rwanda. I find exactly the same kind of relationship. You see, there are certain parallels between genocides. And on these issues, the genocide of the Jews is very similar to the genocide of the Armenians or the Tutsi and certain other groups. There are also major differences, but not in that area.
Do you feel that the Holocaust is a genocide apart from all other genocides?
Yes and no. It is a genocide, so it's parallel to other genocides.
Yes.
The suffering of the victims is the same. There's no difference between a Jew and a Russian or a Tutsi or a, I don't know, a Khmer in Cambodia or American Indian in America and so on and so forth. In a situation of mass murder and genocide, the suffering is always the same. There's no better genocide than another genocide and so on. But structurally, there are basic differences that arise out of the special situation of the Jewish minority, not only in Europe, but basically in Europe. For instance, the fact that the Nazis developed over time, now they didn't start like that, the policy of a total annihilation of every single person they identified as a Jew. Not only in Germany, Poland, Soviet Russia, Europe, but everywhere in the world. Now this is unprecedented. It's not unique. Because if I said it was unique, I would be saying that it happened only once in history. Well, we can forget about it. It won't happen again. But what we call the Holocaust, the genocide of the Jews, is something that was done by humans to other humans for human reasons. It wasn't done by God, it wasn't done by Satan, it was done by humans. Anything that's done by humans can be repeated by humans, never in the same way, but in similar ways. And so this is an unprecedented genocide. It's not unique, it's unprecedented. Which means that it was a precedent. Which means that it can be repeated. So the answer is yes and no. In other words, there is the Holocaust. If you want to discuss genocide, it's one of the areas that I'm currently researching is genocide, a main area actually. When I act, not only research, on prevention of genocide, I start with the Holocaust because that was the most extreme case. So it's parallel and unprecedented at the same time.
Do you feel that there is a, I'm not an expert of genocides, happily, but many genocides seem to have taken place in a situation of war. I mean, the Armenians were, the killing of the Armenians had something to do with World War I.
Yeah.
What really surprised me when I read your books is that the change in the German policy from just enmity towards the Jews and to murdering them was just a year. Because the atmosphere of a war, in which everybody transcends his own or her own moral boundaries, does that add to the possibility of genocide?
Yes, I think so. It's not in every case. If you take, for instance, the situation of the American Indians in the 19th century in North America. In many cases, this was not the result of a war. It was the result of the white attempt, colonial attempt, if you like, or imperialist attempt, to occupy territory where there were riches in the ground, either minerals or simply areas that the whites wanted to settle. So there was no actual war. The war was the genocide. The genocide was the war. But in most cases, I think you're right. There is a connection between war and genocide. If you want to prevent genocide, you have to try to prevent armed conflict, or something that can develop into an armed conflict. We have, for instance, the situation today in Burma, where you have a Muslim minority in the southwest of Burma, in the Arakan region, the Rohingya, the Muslim minority, about 800,000 of them. There's a real danger of a genocide there by the Buddhists. It's not a war. But there is a war going on against the Kachins in the northeast on the Chinese border. That's a war. So it's not in every case, but in some cases. If you want to prevent it, you've got to act against these kind of situations.
Any more questions?
As part of the youngest generation...
Could you raise your voice?
As part of the youngest generation of adult Jews, I would like to ask you, what do you think is the effect of the Holocaust on younger generations of Jews and Jewish contemporary culture?
Well, the Holocaust is not Jewish identity, but it's part of it. You can't escape it. The Jews are traumatized people, which is understandable because 1/3 of the Jewish people was murdered. If you go to Armenians, you find exactly the same thing. If you go to Rwanda, you find exactly the same thing with the Tutsi. If you go to Cambodia, you find exactly the same thing with the Khmer. In other words, these are traumatized societies. Can you escape the trauma? No. Can you deal with it? Maybe. What we do at Yad Vashem in the school, we have the largest school of any kind of school in the country because people come for a day or 2 days or a week. So we had it last year with 160,000 pupils because, you know, they come in droves. We've got a permanent group of teachers, about 45, 50 teachers who work all the time. We have people not only from Israel, but from 52 different countries in the last year. So it's not only Jews, it's Jews and others. But from a Jewish perspective, you have to, first of all, face the trauma. In other words, this is something that you learn in psychology first year. When you have a traumatized person, you have to bring that person to the reality of a situation. This is what we try to do, because the distortions are tremendous. Not willful distortions necessarily. I give you a personal example, if I may, yeah?
Sure.
I no longer go to the Yom HaShoah, the public memorial service at Yad Vashem. Although I'm the academic advisor, I'm supposed to be there, I don't go there. And the reason is I can't listen anymore to the stupid speeches of our presidents and prime ministers and chiefs of staff and chief rabbis and whatnot. It's stupid blah blah. Yeah? Never again. It's happening all over the place, all the time. What do you mean never again? And all these cliches, it's impossible to listen to. What we do in our school is something quite different. We tell the story. We try to tell the people this happened, face it, try to prevent things like that from happening in the future.
Thank you.
Any more questions? Here. Front row.
to come back to the resistance of the prosecuted Jewish people, you have told us about what happened in the ghetto of Warsaw. You told us about the depth and the motivation of the people, how they organized.
Could you raise your voice, because
how they organized their resistance?
Yeah.
Okay. If you look, if I look at the treatment,
at what?
if I look at the treatment,
Yeah.
the Jewish people were treated by the Germans during the war. You can divide, let's say, 3 phases. The first phase is the killing. The second phase is still the killing, but also the forced labor of the Jews, because of, you know, the war went on. And the third one is, let's say, the transportation out of the east to the middle into Germany and to Austria. Now, if we take a look at the second phase, where they were used as forced labor, actually it was, let's say, a couple of months living and still going to die because of the hard labor they had to do. What is known from the resistance during that period?
What is known what?
What is known from the resistance from the Jews during the period that they were in forced labor, so before they died of the hard labor?
Well, we know a great deal about this. The basic idea of the Germans was to utilize Jewish forced labor as long as possible and then to kill them, or have them die in some form or way. Thank you. The people who survived from the forced labor, the Germans simply didn't manage to kill them. The Germans came too late, so to speak, in the death marches, for instance. People in the death marches who were liberated by Allied soldiers. The Germans simply didn't manage to kill all of them. So when the war ended, about 200,000 Jews emerged from the camps and forced labor and death marches and so on. This is my figure. I mean, other colleagues will say a little bit more, a little bit less, but this is what I found. And in all cases that I know of, these were people who were put to hard labor, and the other side simply didn't manage to find the time or the energy to kill them. You can follow this in individual cases very, very clearly. In fact, in some cases, Jewish forced laborers who were transported in the last stages of the war from the east into Germany, basically to clear up debris from Allied bombings in German cities, were sometimes helped by Allied prisoners of war in camps next to them. Yeah? This is a case in point. Or we now have a wonderful book, very important book, by an Israeli historian. It's been translated into English, on the death marches. The name of the author is Blattman, Daniel Blattman. And he tells the story of these death marches. See? And the death marches were marches of people that originally the Germans wanted to use as forced labor. They came from forced labor camps, and they were marched because the Allies were advancing. And as they were marching, they were murdered. But they didn't manage to murder all. Not only Jews, but the Jews were a majority amongst them.
Any more questions? Yes, they're all right. Yeah.
You are an Holocaust expert. Can you tell us how far your expertise has changed your attitude towards human life?
To what?
Towards human life.
To human life.
Did your views on human life change by your researching the Holocaust?
I don't know. I really don't know. I hope I started off like that. I don't really remember. You know, when you get very old, you remember details, but not that kind of a detail. So I can't really tell you. What I do know is that it developed my concentration on this topic, led me not only Holocaust and anti-Semitism, but into the general area of genocide. And you know, today, when you deal with Holocaust history, the majority of historians dealing with the Holocaust are not Jews. Majority are non-Jews. There is, I just come from Britain this afternoon. In Britain there is, I just you know, off the top of my head, there is a young colleague from Germany. His name is Christoph Diekmann, who is a German historian, who is teaching at Kiel University in England. Yeah? Now, Christoph Diekmann wrote a wonderful analysis of the Holocaust in Lithuania. He knows Lithuanian, Yiddish, Hebrew, Russian, and Polish. English, French, and German. So he could do it. In other words, he speaks to me in Hebrew. He can speak perfect Yiddish. The way that anyone here can learn Korean. Why not? You know? The increasing number of people concerned with the Holocaust, the majority are not Jewish at all. In America, for instance. I mean, the top American historian of the Holocaust is Christopher Browning, from an old Mayflower American family, yeah? And you have in Germany, obviously, there's not a single one of these German historians, or the Polish historians in Poland, are Jewish. So this becomes a universal research project dealing with a specific particular group. Now, you can't deal with the Holocaust without knowing something about Jews, very much about Jews. Because it's not the Kamchatkans who were killed, but the Jews who were killed. Yeah? So you have to know something about Jews. Why were the Jews picked? I won't go into that. That's a lecture for another 5 hours. So, but you've got to do that. Now, I don't believe in sort of wild generalization. Yeah? My friend Elie Wiesel does. He speaks, you know, big words. I try not to, because I'm against cliches. So I don't talk about humanity. I talk about practical things to prevent killing of people. This is my passion, if you like. This is what I do. And it starts from the Holocaust. As Luther would have said, Dixi et salvavi animam meam.
That's clear. Do you have an explanation why it seems to me that the interest for the Holocaust is, while it's receding into history, the interest is really rising every year?
Yes, yes, I think I do know the answer. It's because what I said before, it's the unprecedented nature of this particular genocide which leads you to understand other similar events. And therefore it becomes a paradigm, a negative paradigm.
A kind of a standard.
Yeah, a kind of a standard, if you like, a paradigm, a negative one, of course, that you try to avoid. And so you have to study the details of it. And yes, I think that's the reason. I don't know what's going to be in the future. I have no idea. But at the present, as you say, there is a growth, constant growth in interest in this subject.
Professor Bauer, thank you very much for your lecture and for your interview.